So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to our April Literary Modiin author event. I'm Julie Zuckerman, for those who don't know me, author of the Book of Jeremiah. Before we get started, I have just a couple words of introduction. For those of you who aren't familiar, Modiin is a planned city in Israel, halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, right near the airport, so come and visit us. Especially now is a good week to come. We have Yom Ha'atzmaut coming up in a few days. Back to Literary Modiin. We, oh, I see the Facebook thing didn't work. Okay, never mind. We have a large population of English speakers here. So in June 2019, I started Literary Modiin as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to a large community of English readers. And we held several in-person events. And when the pandemic hit, we switched to virtual format, which allows us to hear from authors and welcome attendees from all over the world. And today's event is our 35th, so I think that's pretty cool. The format of today's event is that each author will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we open it up to questions. Everyone is on mute, so if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box during the session, and then at the end, we'll go back and get to all your questions. And any technical difficulties, just send me a private note in the chat. I don't know if we're broadcasting live on Facebook. I'm not sure if it's working, but if we are and you're in Literary Modiin, you can start a watch party. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our first author. Jennifer Rosner is the author of the novels Once We Were Home and The Yellow Bird Sings, which was a Massachusetts Fiction Honored Book and a National Jewish Book Award finalist in the categories of debut fiction and book club. She is also, this is her second time at Literary Modiin, by the way. She's also the author of a memoir, If a Tree Falls, A Family's Quest to Hear and Be Heard, and the children's book, The Mitten String, a Sydney Taylor Book Award notable. Jennifer's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Massachusetts Review, The Forward, and elsewhere. In addition to writing, Jennifer has taught philosophy. She earned her BA from Columbia University and her PhD from Stanford. She lives in Western Massachusetts with her family. So now, Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Am I frozen for everyone?
You are frozen to me.
Yeah.
Oh my
For
God.
me.
Okay. Well, sorry about that. Now you are.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm thrilled to be sharing this time with Elizabeth and Sandi, and to present to this Literary Modiin audience again. So yeah, I was here for when I was presenting The Yellow Bird Sings, which I was going to show you I have my little English version here, but I also have the Hebrew copy, which I thought turned out so pretty. And The Yellow Bird Sings, oh dear, I just threw something off my shelf. The Yellow Bird Sings is about a mother and daughter who were hidden during World War II, and a lot about the role of creativity and beauty and human survival, etc. And I became interested in what happened after the hiding of children during the war. And while I was interviewing a hidden child, really for The Yellow Bird Sings, I met a woman who she had been in a Siberian labor camp during the war, and when she returned to her native Poland, just 3% of Jewish children had survived, and mostly in Christian settings, hidden with, Christian identities. So a mission began to try to retrieve Jewish children from these Christian hiding places, and it involved several different groups and was funded from sources in both the U.S. and Palestine and other places. And I had never heard of this before, and I became really interested in it. The thing that was really striking to me about it was that, this woman described to me that she would go into taverns, that they would try to loosen lips of local Poles if they heard of children who had arrived, during wartime. It was likely these were Jewish children getting stowed for safety, and they would approach the families and they would offer money. They would try to negotiate, but if the families refused, which sometimes they did, they would resort to other things that were either, taking them at dusk out of the fields, just kind of grabbing the children and going. And these kids weren't being taken back to their families. Their families had perished during the war. They were being taken back to Judaism. That sometimes meant a Jewish orphanage. It sometimes meant children's home after children's home, and then eventually trip to, a journey on a boat to Palestine if they were lucky, and this sort of thing. And the reactions of the children, I think, really depended from my research on, the age of the child, what they remembered of their Jewish roots, what relationship they had with the family they were harbored with, and so many other things. I was really struck by the moral complexity of it all, because there was this, there was this sense that this community had been decimated, that they were trying to rebuild a collective, but that on the individual level, it was really tricky for some of those children. And, in the research I'd done, learning that both the children, from the children's perspective, it was very a modeled thing, and also from the sort of operatives' perspective, who had taken those children at the time, felt it was like an imperative and they had to do it, and they were honoring the wishes of these parents who had perished and all this other stuff. And then later, having followed some of those children, seeing how much damage it might have done psychically. So this is one of the sort of cases I deal with in my novel. But what was really interesting is I also started learning of other cases of children who were moved, after losing their first family, moved a second time, according to some adult conceptions of what would be best. And one of those cases was, in the case of Jewish children hidden in convents, there were cases of the church, when relatives came to claim them, the church would then baptize them and take them on the run, try to keep them in the Christian fold for their salvation. And then in an entirely different set of cases, I was learning about the Germanization program to take mostly Christian children and get them into German families or into German settings, to bolster the German population, and maybe because they believed that it would be better to be German than Polish, and all these other ideas. And so children being moved around on these different bases. And I want to say really upfront, like, I don't make any equivalencies between these cases, in the sense that there is no equivalency to make. There's one is, after a genocide, trying to repopulate a group of people who have been decimated, and these other cases were totally different. But from the child's perspective, which is the one I inhabit in the points of view of 4 children, the struggles for, to have what their sense of self and identity, their sense of belonging, what is home, how do you reroute after rupture? These are the things that they do have in common, that children who are moved in general, and moved from, from Ukraine to Russia, and, in all these other different cases that are going on in history, the children's perspective, what they struggle with is what I was thinking about a lot. So I have these 4 narrative lines in Once We Were Home. Oscar and Anna are these Jewish children who are, stowed living with a Polish farm family when they're taken back to Judaism. Roger is harbored by the church, who then steal him over the Pyrenees when an aunt seeks to reclaim him. And actually this aunt is sort of, I'll tell you in a minute, like, a lot of these cases that I work on are rooted in history. And there was this aunt with the last name Rosner who was actually petitioning to get a child back, which I'll talk about. And then the case of Renata, a character in my novel, believes that her German parents are her own, but decades later, the stories of all these people kind of converge in a very gentle way in Israel. So I'm going to share a couple of things. I'm going to go quick because we're going to honor our 15 minutes of time. See if you can, let me try to start my screen. So, oops, that's not what I want. Shoot, you all know what my book looks like. Hang on. How do I get to my video? Okay, let me see if I can't advance it. Shoot. Okay, let me stop sharing. Sorry about that. It should work if I advance the screen. Hang on. Okay. Let me come back. Sorry, I'm not amazing at technology. Can you see that now? This is a picture of, there's a young woman who's ushering a bunch of little children in the leftmost slide. This is an image from the Yad Vashem archives of an operative who is moving children from children's homes, trying to help them along their journey. So when I talk about Oscar and Anna, they were in a Polish family, and then an operative would come and try to get them into a into a Jewish setting, and then eventually over time would be moving them to try, at least from the Zionist group of operatives, to try to get them onto a ship toward Palestine. The case of Roger is actually based on the historical case of the Finley brothers, which are two brothers who were actually, they live in Israel now. They were in a convent, and when actually the woman named Rosner petitioned to reclaim him, they were her aunt. She was their aunt, and was trying to honor her brother's wishes, and it became a completely crazy case where, you know, there were like petitions through the courts, but the church like defied them and ended up with many clergy in jail, etc., just trying whatever they could to keep these children Christian. And just this rather disturbing quick picture of some children who, you know, were undergoing tests for caliper head measurements and eye charts and all sorts of things to see if they could become Germanized. And if they had little things like a mole that was too big on the back of their ear, they might not be able to be Germanized, in which case they would end up in like a child labor camp or some sort of concentration camp, because they weren't always returned home. So I just wanted you to be aware that the cases of my children in my novel are sort of rooted in these deep histories. And in the case of the Jewish operative case, there's a scholar in Israel. She's amazing. Muna Nachmani Gavni wrote this book called Dividing Hearts, which is a lot about the case of these children and the operatives who tried to get them back into Judaism, and a lot of the political struggles and things that went on there. So I don't know, there's a basic overview of the story. And I just want to say I was really interested in how, in the case of the Jewish children and the reclaiming of them, there were even like linguistic disagreements among the operatives who were doing the work. So there would be like some people calling it redeeming the children, some reclaiming, some called it ransoming. There was an argument about whether it could be called rescuing, because the righteous Poles who took children in at their peril, you know, were really considered rescue families, and taking them back into Judaism, there was a real big argument about whether that could be called rescue. So it was interesting that the vocabulary was fraught, that I think that the whole situation was so complicated. And I approach it with a lot of humility, because how can someone, you know, really understand this point of history where these children who had been stowed for their safety, the parents, you know, put them there hoping to be back in a short while. The kids had no parents in the end, no papers in the end, and where they belonged was really this big question. With whom and where do these children belong? And that's the overarching thing I've been most interested in this novel, about sort of searching for with whom children belong. So I'm going to read a really short couple bits. The additional narrative line that's in my novel, in addition to those four children, is actually this. There's a narration by a Matryoshka doll, because one of the characters, when she's taken, is clasping onto the smallest of her dolls. And because she doesn't actually remember, she was very young when a lot of the movements in her life happened, the Matryoshka doll does remember. So the Matryoshka doll is like this child's witness in some sense. And so I just thought I'd read really quickly these few passages that are narrated by that doll's point of view. So the novel begins with a prologue, and the doll is being made here. From primeval forest to ribboned tree, from stout trunk to husked log, I wait. Fine wood shavings drift and swirl, matting the floor like a page upon which stories will be written. I might become a bird with ruffled feathers, a knight astride a whinnying horse, a top that spins around and around. I might become a boy's prized notebook, or a girl's tiny doll, solid to the core and brightly painted. When I'm released from the carver's hand, pink circles gloss my cheeks and flowers travel my red coat. My family's song sets the rhythm of my heart as I nest inside my mother, inside her mother, inside her mother. One inside the other, we are gifted to a little girl. She chooses me, the smallest of our set, to take with her wherever she goes. round framed eyes, a polka dot behind her ear. It is her lost history that I alone will remember. Together, the girl and I skip and swing on playgrounds and weave through the holiday markets. We marvel at the decorated eggs, bright and intricate. I am painted simply, but the girl doesn't mind. At home, while my family nests, we sit at the table as her mama spoons plum dumplings into bowls and her papa says grace. We are in the park one morning when we spot the toy soldiers. They speak strange words, sharp and halting, their eyes cold like wolves. They are not toys. The girl screams when they grab her. She calls out, "Mama, Mama!" I call out too, thrust inside the girl's pocket, my shouts trapped in the folds of lining and wool. We are jostled and bounced to the steady clatter of a train. Though the girl is measured head to toe and given a different name, she is still the same inside. She reaches for me when we enter a house with the mingled smells of pretzels, burned sugar, and chestnuts. She cries for home, for her mama, but she lets the lady with velvet brown eyes lead her to a table to drink cups of milk, squeezing me tight, my red flowered coat peeling off in her hot, padded grip. In time, the girl will settle here, abandoning me for a toy broken into 100 pieces. She'll spend hours fitting it back together. She will eat the lady's frosted cakes and listen to the man's fanciful stories. Just before sleep, she will play with me, sugar on my braids. Okay, I don't know our timing, but maybe I'll read this one last teeny one. I stand watch, waiting for the girl to return home from school, when a woman coated in olive green steps into the room. Insignias ornament her sleeves, yet she doesn't march like a soldier, and her eyes are soft and sad, not like wolves at all. She walks over to my bureau and stares at me, stares at pictures of the girl. I hear her say, "She belongs to another mother." No, she is ours, mine. The velvet-eyed lady waves away the woman's papers and ushers her out the door. Later, she packs up the girl, who grips me tight, and we are once again clattering across landscapes. The girl cries, "Please, I don't want to go." I cry too, lost outside my mother, outside her mother, outside her mother, shuttling farther and farther from home.
So I'm Elizabeth Graver, and my new book is called Cantica, which means, this is my already beaten up version, it just came out, but it means song in Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. And I thought I would talk a little bit about what led me to it and then read you a little bit. So this book has been a really, really, really long time, both in the writing and even longer in the sort of gestation, in that when I was in college in the mid-1980s, I taped my grandmother telling stories. I was 21. I didn't do it for a class. I had a very kind of intense relationship with her, and she was an incredible storyteller, not a writer at all. She was very creative. She was a dressmaker by profession, but constantly drawing and sewing and cooking and talking and singing. And I think at that time, I knew she had a story that I might want to try to write, but I wasn't really ready to do it. But I also, even then, even more now, felt time kind of rushing by, and she was getting older. And so I taped her. And I think part of what led me to do that, in addition to her being such a beautiful storyteller, was that I knew she had an interesting story and I didn't totally understand it. So I knew she was from Turkey and that she was Jewish. She didn't usually use the term Sephardic, but I knew that she was very different from my other grandmother, who was Ashkenazi in just about every way. So from her food to the languages she spoke over my head, which were both Ladino kind of mixed with Spanish because of her migration path, and French sometimes, which I actually did understand. So that was cool because I could kind of peek in. To even the way she kind of inhabited her body and the sorts of things she would talk to me about. So I was confused by her, and also very drawn to her. And I taped her, and she told me all kinds of things about her really rather dramatic life. And she kept saying that she'd grown up very rich and lost everything. And she told me she went to French Catholic school in Istanbul. She told me about having to go seek her first husband after he abandoned her with her two young sons. And so there were all sorts of things. And I gathered all of this. And then in various ways over the years, I think she actually did enter my writing, but not overtly. And she died in 1992. And it wasn't until 2014 that I actually decided to try to really write something, a full book that came out of her story. And I think what drew me to it at that moment was several different things. One was the worldwide refugee crisis and the fact that in our current moment, I was seeing all kinds of things that I knew resonated with my own past, but I didn't know enough about my own past. And another was the fact that the next generation, so my mother and my uncles, I think my cousin Helene, whose father Al helped me hugely with this book, were getting older. And I wanted both to write something to give to them and also interview them and get as much of the story of that generation as I could. So that led me into almost a decade of a really incredible, long, hard, and fascinating and moving process where I went to Spain, Turkey, and Cuba. I interviewed my uncles. I listened over and over and over again to these cassette tapes, wishing in a way that I'd asked more. And at the same time, I'm a fiction writer. And so in certain ways, it was really lovely to have room to imagine. But the things that she talked about, and then later the things that I learned about, both through kind of in-place research, interviewing people. In Turkey, I interviewed people at the Sephardic Home for the Aged and saw some relatives there. But I also read a lot of books and corresponded with scholars. All spoke both to me of a really singular story that was connected to my family history, but in addition, connected to our current time and to these wider questions. Jennifer, I was thinking as you were talking about questions of family separations and what is home. And so in a different context, these were also things that I was exploring. And it ended up being a really interesting process, partly because I've always, all my previous books, I have 4 previous novels and a story collection are fiction. With this book, I did think maybe I should tell it as nonfiction because it's got all these real people. And I ultimately decided not to do that because I wanted to be able to dive into inner life and I wanted to kind of inhabit consciousness in ways that I just couldn't do with nonfiction. But at the same time, I had a really strong feeling of wanting to show the seams in certain ways, both because it's a very personal story for me and because I'm interested in the fact that everybody has a family story and has relics, things like photographs or the absence of relics, which is really a terrible thing, right? Some people have no traces for various reasons, either because the traces were obliterated or because there's all kinds of stories, right? You might be adopted and not know that story, but know a different story. So I decided to write it as fiction, but do a couple somewhat unconventional things, one of which is to include family photographs. I'll hold one up. You won't really, I'm not going to try to screen share. I don't dare. But if you can see that, the little tiny girl, the smallest girl in the white dress is my grandmother, and my website and my book are filled with these photos. And another was to use real names in many cases for the central characters. And when the people were alive, I got permission. So from my 2 uncles who sadly passed away before the book came out, but knew it was coming, and from my mom, my grandmother, I just decided to use her real name. She really liked the spotlight. I decided, she's not here to tell me no, but I kind of think she'd say yes. And so the book has a lot of seams, and it was really interesting to me to try to kind of figure out how to navigate that on the one hand, I want it to be a novel. And on the other hand, I want it to be gesturing towards the real, not just in terms of the personal story, but also in terms of the history. So I was very interested in using Ladino in it, which I don't speak. I learned a little. I sat in on a class, and in using the other languages. So there's a lot of linguistic crossings. There's a lot of country crossing. So in real life, as in the novel, she began in Turkey in a rather prosperous family that lost all their money. And at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they moved to Spain, which was a very strange place for Sephardic Jews to, quote, go back to, right? Having been expelled during the Spanish Inquisition many hundreds of years prior. And in Spain, my great grandfather Alberto was the caretaker of a tiny unmarked synagogue. So I found some really fascinating things in my research, but also in writing the novel, ended up inhabiting the point of view of the character called Alberto in ways that I really hadn't anticipated. I never met the real person. My mother never met him. He was killed in the bombing of Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. So this story is a kind of little thread of what happened to one family, and it's a story that hasn't been told that much. Interestingly, there are right now a couple really beautiful books that just came out that are about the Sephardic story. So Michael Frank has one called 100 Saturdays, The Lost World of Stella Levy, that's nonfiction, but reads almost like a novel about a woman from Rhodes who was deported to Auschwitz and now is almost 100, and he interviewed her in New York. There's a new book by Alexander Hemon called The World and All That It Holds that has Ladino. But overall, the Sephardic story has not been, the Sephardic story of immigration to America anyway, has not been told that much. And there's this odd, you can never predict this, but there's this odd little burst now of narrative. So in Israel, of course, there's the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem. There's a really good Netflix show called Kulep, or The Club, that's Turkish, that's also about the Sephardic community. So for me, it's been incredibly fun to and moving to encounter these other people exploring this world. I've connected with several musicians, and I'm doing a couple events with people doing Sephardic singing. It's a very interdisciplinary book in a certain way, in that it's filled with music and filled with history and filled with food. And it's such a rich world, but also a world that's had so many dispersals and losses through these various diasporas. So I felt, I think, in writing it, a mix of both joy, and my grandmother was a notably joyful person who, no matter what happened, she had a really hard life in a lot of ways, would always kind of pick up the scraps and make something beautiful, and sorrow, right? And loss, and the way that people are being moved around through these giant events that they don't have control of. So I thought I would read just a little bit about, I'm going to read you a passage from when Rebecca, which is the main character's name, as well as my grandmother's name, is in Barcelona. And her family has moved there. She has gone from being a rather privileged girl in Turkey to apprenticing herself as a dressmaker to needing to find work in Spain. And they're living in Barcelona. And she goes off, this is a fictional scene, but in real life, she did find work in Spain. She goes off to look for a job as a dressmaker, and runs into a lot of barriers. First, because she's too well dressed, and the people she's looking for jobs from say, you can't be this fancy. We serve fancy people, but they don't want you to be fancy. So then she dresses down, and then she tells someone that her name is Rebecca Camayor Cohen, and the woman reacts very badly and kind of realizes she's Jewish and is very panicked by that because of the complex history of what it means to be Jewish in Spain, even in 1924, which is when this is set, even now, arguably to some extent. So the woman, the dressmaker, tells her, who speaks Catalan and Castilian, and they kind of fumble through some languages, tells her to change her name to, her professional name, to Rebecca Blanco Camayor. Camayor was my great grandmother's maiden name and doesn't signal as Jewish as much as Cohen. So she decides to do that, and I'm just going to read a page that follows that scene. This is on page 72 of the book, where she's mulling over, after all of this, who she is. So similarly, I think, Jennifer, to some of the questions in your book, like, who are you? Who are you born as? Who are you named as? Who are you, depending on your context? How do you change yourself to have to pass? But then how do you also find richness in these new contexts? One of the interesting things for me in imagining Rebecca is, in certain ways, she loves Barcelona. She's out in the streets. It's beautiful. She's an independent woman in some ways. And in other ways, she's lost all of these things, and she's having to hide, and she's having to kind of reckon with this weird ghostly history that's not even spoken most of the time, which has to do with conversos and what it means to be Jewish in Spain and how the country has kind of pushed down a lot of the past. So this is just a kind of lyrical little passage. Ken sos tu? I am Rebecca, Rebecca, spelled with a K, from my mother's mother and the wife of Isaac in the Bible. The name means to tie firmly or to snare, which is why, or so her mother used to tell her when she struggled at sewing, she could, with practice, become skilled with a needle and thread. I am Kamayor from my mother's father, Behor Kamayor of blessed memory, and also Cohen, high priest, descended from the sons of Aaron, a name she feels she must live up to, though she'll hide it as needed, and may God forgive her. I am from the pomegranate tree my father planted at my birth, from my nuns in white habits, my staircase with the worn ninth tread, the candlelight reflected in my fingernails. I am a gypsy girl because to have no home place had once seemed romantic, and she could do the dance, just as she could climb ropes at gymnastics, rising and lowering at will. Or was it actually that home back then was everywhere? On Sundays, she had house hopped, each door an opening, aunts and cousins, friends and friends of friends, visiting until she swelled with cake and apple tea. This, the beautiful time, if there was blood, and there was blood, being shed in her city, she'd neither seen it nor smelled it. She hadn't been frightened, hardly ever. Her name was her name, the future abundant. When I grow up, when I get married and live near my best friend, when I travel the world and come home to my house at the top of the hill and my other house at the edge of the sea. She'd like to watch the gypsies dance, to drop coins in their hats as her own hips swayed and her foot began to tap. The gypsies set up camp in different spots throughout the city and melted away when you weren't looking. And though Rebecca had studied the faces of the girls her age, she rarely saw the same ones twice. At the time, their constant motion had seemed to her a kind of freedom. Now you see me, now you don't. And it had only recently occurred to her that maybe they moved because they couldn't stop, and that if they'd been paid to dance and sing, they were also paid in some kind of twisted economy to go away. Where are you from? Between lightness and dark, between Israel and the nations, between the seventh day of rest and 6 days of labor. With her eyes closed, she can enter the sound to become part of the vastness, a mote, a stitch, pure breath. Between night and day, water and air, fire and water. I am from Blanco, nothingness, the self erased, wiped clean. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sorry that my Zoom froze and I didn't get to introduce you. I don't know if Jennifer introduced you.
Don't worry.
Okay. All right. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. But before I do, I'll just give Elizabeth a little, I guess, post-introduction since she just spoke, but I'll just make it short. This is Cantica is Elizabeth's 5th novel. As you heard, it was inspired by her grandmother, Rebecca Nacon Baruch Levy. Elizabeth's 4th novel, The End of the Point, was longlisted for the 2013 National Book Award in Fiction and selected as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Her other novels are Awake, The Honey Thief, and Unraveling, and her story collection, Have You Seen Me, won the 1991 Cruz Hines Literature Prize. The mother of 2 young adult daughters, she teaches at Boston College and lives outside of Boston. So sorry I didn't get to say that before you spoke. Okay, now I will introduce our 3rd author. Sandi Wisenberg is the author of The Wandering Womb, Essays in Search of Home, which won the Juniper Prize in Nonfiction and was published by the University of Massachusetts Press. She's also the author of a short story collection, The Sweetheart Is In, an essay collection, Holocaust Girls, History, Memory, and Other Obsessions, and a nonfiction chronicle, The Adventures of Cancer Bitch. She's a 4th generation native Texan who lives in Chicago and edits another Chicago magazine. She has an MFA in fiction from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop and a BSJ from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. She was a feature writer for the Miami Herald and has published prose and poetry in the New Yorker, Plowshares, New England Review, among others. And let me spotlight you. Hold on. Sand. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. And can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I am coming to you from Chicago, which I'm about half a mile west of Wrigley Field, where they are playing baseball, even though it's around 40 degrees. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'll read and then talk some more. I love how in readings, there's always some of the same themes come up, and I know some of them seem to be have arranged by Julie. That we have two of us have home in the title, but I think there's always some synchronicity about topics. My book is also about World War II, Holocaust, family, immigration, but it's a very different immigration. Instead of going to Barcelona and before that to Turkey, my family went to Alabama and Georgia. First of all, this is a collection of essays. Somebody said to me, "Oh, are these just a bunch of your old essays put together?" And I was very irate and indignant. And I said, "Oh, no." But of course, that's what it is. I've tried to put them together in a way that makes sense. I've revised each one of them. I hope that that the book is more than the sum of its parts. And in a collection, you hope that the different pieces talk to each other. There is one connection with all of them, and it's me, even though the title piece, The Wandering Womb, doesn't have me in it. It's got my attitude, but also I think larger than me, and I know larger than me, is history. The book is in a way about what it's like to live inside of history, to be aware that history is also outside of you, to see yourself as a part of many things, a mass of people, a Jew, the history of the Jews, a Southerner, a woman, and someone with anxiety and asthma. The home that is in the subtitle, Essays in Search of Home, means a lot of different things. One is that I think I never felt at home in my body. I was not born with asthma, but supposedly I got asthma when I was 3 days old. So since infancy, I collect all my ephemera, and I see that in my pre-nursery class, I was absent a third of the time. So I think that was mostly asthma. And when you have asthma, you can't really be unself-conscious because asthma it keeps you from breathing, and it keeps you from breathing well. So you're always aware of something that you really shouldn't be aware of. When I was really young, like 6 or 7, our air conditioner went out, and this is a big deal in Houston, which is very, very hot and very humid. And so my parents did something they'd never done before. They opened the windows, and there were screens. And so we had windows open and the screens were there, and I could hear all these different movements outside. And I'm in Houston, and it's warm. And of course, I think the sounds are not insects, but they're Nazis. And this is in the 1960s, and I'm not thinking neo-Nazis. I'm not thinking the Klan, which did exist in Texas. I'm thinking the Nazis are coming to get me, and I will not survive because of my asthma, because I can't bring my inhaler. I can't bring my medicine. I also wore glasses, and I will just be at a loss and I will die. And I even had a bag that I would keep in my bedroom in case I had to leave. And again, this is in the 1960s. My parents were not immigrants. They were both born in the US. My mother was born in Dallas. My father was born in Mississippi. Their parents were from Eastern Europe. 3 of my grandparents were immigrants, and 1 was born in Dallas. So it's not like the Holocaust was all around us, but I connected my asthma to the Holocaust. I wrote a book earlier called Holocaust Girls, and it's about people who love the Holocaust too much, which is me, but I think there are other people who use the Holocaust as a symbol. They use the Holocaust as a way to be Jewish. You know, they use it as sort of this exciting piece of history, like, oh my God, if my parents or my grandparents or my great-grandparents hadn't immigrated, I wouldn't exist. I would have died. They would have died. They would have been murdered. I also, when I was a reporter, I interviewed some people who were adult survivors of incest. And for one of them said she envied people who had gone through the Holocaust because nobody said the Holocaust didn't exist. Well, that's not true. A lot of people say it doesn't exist, but there was a lot of belief that the Holocaust really did exist because it did exist. And she said there was no, and they had numbers, and she had nothing on her to prove that she had been sexually abused. I think the Holocaust is also a version of our crucifix. We want something to stand in for our suffering. And I think Auschwitz is a stand-in for our suffering, while at the same time, it is our suffering. The book is also about being a woman. It's also about being a Jewish woman. It's about being a Southern Jewish woman and a woman who wanders. I have a lot of travel in here. And I'm going to read a little bit from the first piece, which just the very end. It's called Female Protection. And it's about going to Istanbul by myself. And the first day meeting this guy from Austria, and we just palled around together. And I was the first Jew he had ever met in the flesh. He had seen a rabbi on TV once. And I talked about being Jewish. We talked about the war. We talked about the Baader Meinhof gang. We talked about, is it ever permissible to have violence for the sake of a cause? And we talked about just huge thematic issues, which sometimes I find myself talking about them with people I don't know well, because you can't talk about the little things. And then he said, well, you come visit whenever you can. And by that time he had moved to Vienna and I was traveling in Europe. So he met me at the airport and took me to his house. And I was staying with him, not in a romantic way. And I had my period and I didn't know what to do with my tampons because I didn't think they would go down the toilet. There was no trash can in the bathroom. I didn't want to put them in the kitchen trash can because I did a little bit though. So I'd carry around my old tampons and pads in my backpack, and I would just throw them away at various parts in the city. And I also was doing some research on Jewish history, and he wanted to show me all the big sites of Vienna. And I just felt very narrow to talk, that I wanted just to see Jewish things. So I was very self-conscious and a little uncomfortable about it. So this is the last part. It still felt very much like the Cold War. Back in Vienna, when Vienna was supposedly full of spies, the heart of Europe. I was a spy in the old empire, a Jew masquerading as an innocent American tourist, pretending concern for saucer tarts and Baroque palaces and their history, visiting, say, the Resistance Museum and looking impassively at the artifacts, chess sets molded from bread, pretending a lack of scorn for the veneration of communists and Catholics to the exclusion of Jews. I went by myself to Freud's apartment. The good doctor had taken most everything with him when he and his family left after much difficulty for London in 1938. Now, instead of Freud's furniture and statues, there were black and white photographs of his furniture and artifacts all along the walls, roughly where the real objects had once been. A binder with multilingual pages gave the history of the absent artifacts. I needed to use the restroom. I went to Freud's. It was large, like in an American house, clean with white tiles, with a perfect metal trash basket for my American Jewish female unmentionables. What does a woman want? Freud asked. See above, a clean bathroom, a lined trash basket. And I forgot to set the timer, so Julie, if you can give me like a little notice when I have
Yeah,
5 minutes left.
you're fine. You actually have like, I don't know, 3 more minutes if you want.
Okay. Now just, I'm afraid you're going to think it's all about menstruation. It isn't, but there is a little bit more about it. I have a piece about the mikveh, and it's got all different kinds of writing in it. And it is maybe a mirror image of what you heard from the other 2 readers, because my book is nonfiction, but there's some projection and a little bit of speculative nonfiction. And I have a parable that goes with the mikveh. And some of you know about the parable of the wise men and the elephant, that each one touches part of the elephant and says what the elephant is like. For example, one of the blind wise men touches the trunk and says, "Oh, the elephant is like a snake." Parable, the 7 wise men and the menstruating woman. 1, the blind man says, "The woman smells of rust and fermentation. She must be confined so that she does not wet and ruin our things." 2, the proud man says, "The woman is flowing over. A river is flowing through her. There is no room for me. I can make no impression. Banish her." 3, the young man said, "When she nurses my siblings, she does not bleed. Therefore, when she bleeds, she is selfish, not providing for others. Punish her for displaying her blood." 4, the old man said, "She bleeds, though she is not ill. Therefore, she is an affront to me, for when I bleed that copiously, it means that I am dying." 5, the fastidious man said, "Sometimes there are clots, and other days there are yellow discharges. We must classify all of them and measure them because they are foreign." 6, the priest said, "We make animal sacrifices. We bloodlet animals. The woman will see this and think herself superior because she bleeds and does not die. Therefore, keep her from the temple." The fearful man said, "If she bleeds from that place and does not suffer from it, then she may imagine that if she unmans us, we will bleed also without harm. We must keep tools and sharp objects from her." Because the blood had nothing to do with them, because the blood meant that the seed had been rejected, because she will think herself powerful, that she can bleed without pain or wound. So they must make her see that bleeding means she is incomplete. When she is bleeding, she is less likely to conceive, and so could have sex with anyone without consequences. And they cannot abide the lack of consequences. So I think that's it.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna add the other authors to the spotlight. So start putting your questions in the chat. And I'm gonna see, I think I'm here as like in 2 different Zooms. So let's see if I add this one. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I can
Okay.
see.
That's like my old user that was in here. I don't know. Okay. But I'm speaking from the other one. Who knows how Zoom works? Okay. Great readings and talks, everyone. Thank you so much. I didn't see too many questions in here yet, so I'll start with one of my own, which is for all 3 of you, which is, as you were working on your book, whether the research or the writing or the imagining or putting together your collections in, what surprised you? What did you come across in the process that surprised you?
I can say one quick thing. Many things surprised me. One thing that surprised me was just an incredible research find, which was that I was stumbling around trying to picture Jewish Barcelona in the 1920s, and there's not a lot. And I found an old film from 1929 called Jews of the Spanish Homeland, a silent film, and was watching it. And it was a very weird film, kind of showing a kind of philo-Sephardic, a troublesome film in its tone, kind of anthropological and odd, and basically saying like Sephardic Jews are Spaniards, but in a way that made me a little queasy even before I knew the context. And all of a sudden it said there's even a little Jewish oratorio in the subtitles in Spanish in Barcelona. And there was a picture, a live picture of a woman with two little boys, and also of a man in a garden. And I thought, I think that's my family. And it was. So then I sent it to they were unattributed in it, but I sent it to my uncle in his 90s, and he said, holy shit, how'd you find that? Because he was 2, but moving across the screen. So that was, and then immediately I was like, I got to do something with this. And then my big problem was that it took over, and the filmmaker was this really crazy man who became a fascist. And I could have just gone like into him. So I had to then reel myself back. But I love how research can lead. I don't know if this has happened for either of you, Jennifer and Sandy, but it can lead you into things that you just absolutely could not have imagined. So now the filmmaker does come to the house and he has a chapter, but it was about 3 times longer than it finally turned out to be.
For me, the latest essay in here has to do with my relatives in Selma. And when I was teaching at the University of Alabama for a semester, and I would drive to Selma a lot. And all the convergences were very strange for me. I had located where the stores were that my grandparents had, my great-grandparents and a relative had a store, and it was the same place, the same street where this African-American woman was doing kind of reenactments of the Middle Passage. And the first time I was there, I was going on a tour, and I was in a museum, and I realized that this museum had been a hospital, and it was the hospital where my great aunt had died. So it's like everything's happening at the same time or the same place.
I think for me, there's something similar in that the discovery of these particular movements of children, like the movement or the mission to reclaim Jewish children, and to do so, in the same way that like Jews had been persecuted, Jews were returned. Like there wasn't really, they weren't making any fine-grained distinctions. Do you know what I mean? They're not, they just, you know, as a Jew, you're going this way, and as a Jew, you're going that way, kind of thing. And the thing is that I think that that was very surprising to me. But then what was maybe the most surprising for me is I never know exactly why I'm writing something until near the end. I think I understand why I was driven to my desk every day. And our daughters are both born deaf, and we are hearing parents of deaf children, and that's a very specific thing to be, because you know, as there's a lot of questions about how one ought to raise a deaf child that don't occur to any others in any other setting, really. But what's interesting about it is that people think that they might determine that a child should be here rather than there on the basis of things like whether they're growing cilia in their ear, you know. And while I don't think it's the same at all, again, like no equivalencies, but making decisions about where a child belongs and to whom they should, you know, belong, and where they should be raised and stuff based on facts that like adults are thinking about, and not about children's like intimacies and connections and relationships and loves and where they are in their family. You know, these aren't the considerations. Rather, the considerations are these thought patterns about, you know, politics and religion and other ideological things. So I was surprised by the finds of my research, but I was also surprised in some ways to discover late in the game why I was driven personally, like, you know, more than just that this is interesting, I'll write a book about it, but rather that there was something pretty deep down and close to the bone for me.
Yeah, and in your book, Oscar really he's so distraught to be ripped away from his from the Polish parents that those are the only parents he ever knew. Did you meet anyone who was like Oscar, like that kind of, for a long time he wishes that he hadn't been ripped away from them, and you know, wanted to go home back to the farm in Poland? Did you meet anyone like that?
I mostly really met them by reading archival testimonies.
Mhm.
Yeah, it wasn't as much like in-person meetings, but reading a lot of stories, reading interviews, etc., about the kind of really big, yeah, emotional difficulties.
Okay, another question for Jennifer from Erica. Can you speak a bit about your impression of the Jewish literary community / resources, whatever that may mean to you, in kidlit as compared with writing for adults?
Interesting. I don't know much about the kind of kidlit world. I did write a children's book called The Mitten String, and it was published by Random House, and then it was picked up by the PJ Library. So one thing that's interesting is that resource and that group is always looking for stories, Jewish stories, stories about Israel often, etc. And this is a program that is one where they publish a book and then they have it sent. It's funded by the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, and they send it to thousands and thousands of children at different age levels, because they're trying to give them books that have Jewish content. They feel, you know, they're wanting to supplement people's libraries with books with Jewish content. So that's like a very limited bit of experience I have with sort of Jewish community and writers for children, but that's about all I got.
We have that here in Israel too. I mean, they translate some of the books into Hebrew, and we would get them.
Yes.
Done. Okay. Okay. A great question from Michelle. I would love to hear, especially from Jennifer and Elizabeth, a bit about their processes and experiences in inhabiting their characters in order to be able to write them.
Go ahead.
Okay, briefly. So that's such a good question. It's such a big question. I mean, for me with this book, there were almost two different sets of issues depending on the characters. And if it was a character that was someone I knew in flesh and blood, which is my grandma, you know, inspired by, I will say this is fiction, so I keep having to kind of backtrack, but my grandmother, my uncles, etc. I think the issue was that there's so much complexity in a real person, and what do you leave out? And it's really hard. In some ways, I think it's harder than a more purely fictional character. the character in a way that surprised me the most, I mentioned earlier, was Alberto, the character that was inspired by my great grandfather. And I knew about 5 things about him. I knew he was a lousy businessman. I knew he was a kind of intellectual manqué. I knew he loved to garden. I knew he'd lost all his money. And I knew he'd had a wife who had mental health, major mental health issues, and a first wife whom he tried to divorce and had moved to England for 10 years in order to do that. And my grandmother had said that in Istanbul, this woman used to sit in a window. She was childless and unmarried at that point, and look down and call to my grandmother. So I had about 6 things, but they were really moving and kind of contradictory things in various ways. And so he was a character who really took over and whom I loved imagining. And then what became complicated was that because this book follows Rebecca, she's the through thread, but I inhabit a whole bunch of other points of view along the way. Once she left Barcelona and had to leave her 2 children behind for quite a while and leave her parents and a bunch of siblings, she went to New York by way of Cuba for an arranged marriage. She left Alberto behind, and so my narration did too. And so I had this sense at various points of wanting to go back, wanting the point of view to go back and go back to the characters. But I also thought she had to leave them. I have to leave them too. And that sort of pang, that loss, I actually want my reader to feel also. Mm-hmm. So that question of what to pick up in a big book, this book took me almost a decade and it covers a lot of ground. So what to pick up, when to go inside someone's head, when to leave them, was complicated. And it was also really complicated to try to depict the characters who were based on real people that I had days of interviews with and loved and knew, because also then you picture them over your shoulder, so mm-hmm. It's much easier to write about dead people, honestly.
I'll just say, there's always these debates about whether it's whether a writer should inhabit a particular character or, occupy a particular point of view. And it's funny for me, I think I have a strong identification with all of the characters in this novel, especially these 4 children, but I felt most identified with the 2 boys. And I don't really know what that's all about. One of them's a philosopher and so am I, and that might have been part of it. And one has, he has his hands in nature in a very particular way that I don't particularly have, but I just really related to him. And I think that, I don't know, for this novel, especially because I wanted to be, I was really up close, almost like behind their eyes. I wanted to be like in their points of views, very close third point of view, because I was really interested in their sense of these issues, belonging and identity and longing and what is home and all this stuff. And I think for me, I must draw on these unconscious things, that just kind of they develop. And when Elizabeth was naming like all these features of the characters, I guess when you're building these fictional characters, you're doing the same. You're sort of fleshing out these details of particulars of their lives, and then they're them, and then you're with them. And I think it just the time and somehow, I don't know, for me, an affection grows for even the ones who aren't so lovable. In the novel, some terrible adults, you still sort of understand their point of view from all these different angles, because if you're going to inhabit them at all, they become realer, and then it's just, it's not flat anymore.
Mm-hmm. You have to, I think, right? You have to, if you want to not be fun. Okay, there's a question, Diana, for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but I'm going to expand it for Sandi as well. Have any reader responses? Have you heard from any readers with responses whose stories reflect the ones in your books or essays? In Sandi's case,
Sandi, do you want to?
I don't know. My book just came out. I've only done a couple readings. I read it. I was at the College of Charleston in South Carolina at the Jewish Southern Jewish Studies Center, and it was mostly Northerners there who had come to South Carolina. And we talked a lot about the difference between Southern Jews and Northern Jews, and how it's not necessarily in the book, but when I got to know the Jews in Selma, I understood how, on the one hand, they were considered white, and the Klan didn't really want to go after the Jews, and there was a Jewish guy who was helping the Klan. On the other hand, they were really scared, and when the Northern Jews came over in the early 60s and mid 60s for voting rights, they were very nervous, and they tried really hard to separate themselves from them. And even the rabbi in Selma chastised one of his congregation for inviting one of the outsider Jews for dinner.
Wow.
So.
Jennifer, Elizabeth, you remember to repeat the question?
Yeah, I see it. I would say that the woman I interviewed got to read the novel, but she died before the book came out. But she, it was very important to me that she felt comfortable with it, just because she was the inspiration of the story. In a certain way, she like led me into this whole area, and I felt like I felt really glad. I mean, it was interesting. There would be certain details, really, you read sometimes about life on a kibbutz and on how people were treated, especially like the Jews from Europe coming to the kibbutz sometimes were pretty, it seems like there was a lot of bullying, and there were some really mean things said about people who had survived, with terrible words like soap and etc. And I remember that was what she got very upset about that. And I was like, I'm taking it out. Why should we upset there's no need to bring this. I mean, it's just, but overarchingly, she really valued the novel and was so happy that I wrote it. And now her daughter has felt the same, and we've been in touch. So I've been sort of in mostly the one reader who's very, very connected to this all is from that family, that family and their children. So, yeah.
My book also just came out on the 18th, so I've only just started doing events, and I have met a few people. But what's happened kind of leading up to that, I mentioned briefly earlier, but I've just been running across and starting to do collaborations with other people doing work in the kind of Sephardic world. And it was amazing. Recently, I suddenly was online and saw that there was something at Brookline Booksmith, which is in my, in Boston, where I live, called Cantica. And I thought, wait a minute, that's not me. My book isn't even out yet. But it turns out that there's this really wonderful young musician, Israeli originally, but lives in Boston now, named Tuti Druin, who, with her Puerto Rican husband and her brother, have a new musical project called Cantica. So we wrote to each other. First, I panicked a little, and I thought, no, this is great. Let's just go for it. Like we're in different genres anyway. And then we had a little book party after my first reading, and she and Edmar, her husband, came and sang these Ladino songs. And so that was just beautiful. Like I love, the fact that my book has all this music and is called Song, and the audiobook narrator sings them. So I'm loving all the ways in which these other forms are speaking back and forth in that kind of duet, because I think of my book as kind of a duet anyway. In terms of actual people, I'm starting to find people with some echoes, but of course, every story is so singular. Aaron Hamburger, who was on here and who's going to be with you next time, Julie, and I haven't met in person online, but we met online, but we haven't met in person, though we're going to do an event together. But our grandmothers both migrated to Cuba and then New York. His is Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe, and mine Sephardic. So that was a really interesting convergence and difference. And I think somebody linked, we did a conversation in chat.
Yeah, Erica put the link
in. Thank you, Erica. So, I love both the differences and the meetings, but it's been really, really moving and interesting already.
Okay, we're basically out of time, but I wanted to, I put in the chat here, the next event, which is on May 21st with Aaron Hamburger, and his book, Hotel Cuba, which I
It's
just
great.
finished reading
Beautiful
yesterday.
novel.
Yeah.
Mm.
And Judy Levinson, who's also here or was here. Our names do not appear, and Jonathan Peppernick, Gallery of the Disappeared Men. So I always send out a email tomorrow with all the links, but if you want to get a jump on it and register now, the link is in the chat. And as our links, I think I saw Jennifer and Elizabeth both put their discussion guides in here. And I'll send all the links. I want to thank everybody for, one last question from my mom. Thanks, Mom.
Oh, yeah.
For Jennifer, how did you find out about the Germanization of Polish children? How many were found by their parents?
Yeah, I'll really quick because I know everyone needs to go. But I just want to point to, in terms of, this is an amazing book by Gita Sereny called The Healing Wound. And I mean, there's a lot of sources to learn about the Germanization of Polish children. But this woman, Gita Sereny, was a UNRRA worker. So she ended up being tasked with going into these German homes with whom these children had now grown up over years, and trying to help them be separated to be repatriated to their families. And she could not believe that she would be a party to this huge next rupture after the first one, and that's a lot about, thematically what was going on with all the kids in my novel, was that they had this first rupture of losing their original family, and then they got attached or bonded with this new, family or setting or whatever, and then they were taken from that. And this book is so powerful and moving, and she has articles also on the web if you'd rather not read the entire thing, but just these segments about her process and like the experience of the children. And there were other things. Actually, there's a lot on my website. There's all these reading resources on my website that you can link up to, right on the link I gave, where there's and there's a big kind of citation at the end of the novel too, with a lot of sources. So yeah. I mean, there's a lot of debate about the numbers too, just to say, it's very hard to pin down how many kids were taken and then how many were returned. But I have to tell you that far fewer returned than were taken. Yeah.
I'll just add one personal note. I remember when you were doing the research about this and came to Israel, and the story of, in your book, the child Roger, right? And he's basically kidnapped by the church, so that the aunt won't get him. And I was just thinking how grateful I was in my own family that my cousin, who was hidden at an abbey, and by the end of the war, he wanted to convert to Catholicism, right? And the priest of the abbey said, no, well, let's wait until your parents come back and you have their permission. He wouldn't convert him. And his parents never came back, but the rest of the family who were already in the States, were still there to claim him. And so I guess I'm grateful that my own family did not have that experience.
Yeah. And there were these righteous nuns and priests who tried to keep the Jews, the Jewish children to just hold out and know who they are and get
Right.
to be able to go back to who, their Jewish roots. So not all of, it shouldn't be generalized. It's just that there were these particular cases. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wait, there's one more question, I think, for Sandi. Do you see that question, Sandi, from Bessie? I wonder if Sandi's underlining moralistic attitudes like we must have consequences and make judgments and rail against many societal norms. I wonder what Freud would have said in response to her experience in his toilet.
Well, the latter is easier to answer. The first one is we must have consequences and make judgments. I just think in this particular case, I'm saying that the people who came up with the laws of Nida feel like they had to make judgments about women and women's excretions monthly.
And on that note, I think we will wrap things up. I want to say big thank you to Sandy and Jennifer and Elizabeth and to everybody on the line tonight. And again, apologies for my technical difficulties. And good thing, Jennifer, I made you co-host before. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Chag Sameach to those of us in Israel.
Yes.
And see you next month on May 21st.
Thank you
so much.
Julie.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.